Hey, thanks everyone for the opportunity to come along here on such a fine day. Just looking around the audience, I recall my 50th birthday when I stood up and looked around the people that were gathered there, and I said, there's not a single person here who I haven't had an argument with. And I sense that's the occasion here as well, that there's lots of people I've had arguments with over the years. And I was reminded too of Scott saying, well, in case of an emergency, and I was figuring that just rush outstairs in case of an earthquake and wait for the tsunami. And about 6 months ago, and concluding about 3 months ago, I did some work looking at what, a rough number, and I use the word rough without reservation, for future demand for social housing, because in the work that we do in the Salvation Army, they're saying, well, how many houses would you build? And that's a good question. And I think it's a question that has to be tempered both by what we believe is the demand, what we believe is a reasonable response to that demand, and what we believe is politically feasible. So this isn't anything, the numbers I'm going to offer here aren't anything scientific. They are simply some broad guesses at what the underlying demand for social housing is going to be over the next 15 years or so, and what we believe is a feasible response that a government such as the one we now have could make to that. And the magical number, I'll start at the end and work backwards. The magical number is between 2,000 and 2,500 a year. Okay, so and I'll work out how we get there. One of the things, and sometimes I'm challenged on this, because what tended to happen with the last government was that the idea of social housing was presented as being a neoliberal trick. That in actual fact the government had adopted the concept of social housing as a guise for selling off state housing. And as we'll see in some of the figures subsequently, there is an element of truth to that. But I think it's important that we understand what we mean by social housing. For me, it's always been housing that's provided outside of the market, however that's done. And certainly I don't resolve from this idea of social housing and the public housing being a part of that, but not the whole part of it. But I think too that, particularly with the last government, the agenda shifted quite subtly, and we needed, I think, to talk about state housing more emphatically as a way of shifting the agenda back to talking about public investment and public enterprise. But it's still, and I've got friends who will say that I'm a treacherous running dog for talking about social housing and the community sector as opposed to public housing, but I believe that it's important to distinguish the two. And this is a model that I've offered in the report that's available online. And I won't dwell on it, but the reality is that there's two parts to it. One is who owns the housing, and the other is who provides it. And as we've seen, that there's various ways of being able to do that. So we can have a public agency both owning and providing the housing. As we know, we can have a public agency leasing the housing off the private sector and providing it directly. We can have what in this report I've deemed to be private providers, being anything outside of the state and local government, which includes most of us here today, as owning the house and providing it, and we can even then do that on contract. So I'm just using that as a framework. I think it's important that as we move forward, and I know that this government will be more inclined to want to go back to public housing models, that one of the challenges the community housing sector is going to face is how is it relevant in this new environment. And I think previously I'd been involved with CHAR, as many of you know, and we struggled with the Labour Party in particular, and the fact that they're married almost to Housing New Zealand. And for example, and I won't dwell on this, but housing, the real problem with the Labour Party, in my view, is that, and I should be a bit careful here, is that they see bureaucracies in very romantic terms, and all of us know that Housing New Zealand, even in the good days, wasn't that good, and in the bad days has been pretty bad. And so if we are to reinvent public housing, I think we need to think about the institutional models for that, and I think community housing has a real role to play in terms of offering alternative models that might be able to be benchmarked against the public provision of housing. Anyway, I think I'd suggest that you think about the frameworks that we use when we refer to social housing. These are my estimates of the numbers of social housing units in March 2017, about 6 months ago. And what I think is important to do is distinguish between social housing units that were provided with IRRS and those that weren't. And the government, and I've written blogs about this, were very disingenuous, I love that word, in terms of the way they represented the numbers. And if you actually disaggregated the numbers, many of the numbers, and I've said this, were fanciful. They were just inventions in the minister's imagination, or at least her advisors, that they didn't exist in the real world. And it's important too to think about the numbers that the government promised it would provide, because what was happening, and many of us would be aware of that because we were party to it, certainly the Salvation Army was, of taking social housing units that weren't receiving IRRS and put them into the IRS scheme. And the government said, there's another social housing unit. And we said, no, it's not actually another social housing unit. It's just, there's no new stock. It's simply been changed the way it's been funded. And so it's important to actually look at the total stock and think about how that's funded in order to make certain that when we do talk about additional stock, we're talking about additional stock and we're not simply these shifts in funding model. And in particular, I believe there's around 83,000 units, of which 62,500 were in the Housing New Zealand stable, 11,000, nearly 12,000 local councils, and about 8,000 in NGOs and others. And the report, the footnote references go back to the source of that data. One of the things that's important to realise is that the government was selling off state housing, and it was done so on a number of guises. One of it, of course, was there was some transfers. This hasn't included the transfer of the Tauranga stock, but it does include the transfer of the Tamaki stock into the Tamaki Redevelopment Agency. But as you can see, from a maximum of around about 69,500 units in 2011, we're down to about 68,000, 67,000, including the Tamaki housing. And much of that was the way it went down in numbers was, in some respects, there was some subtle sell-offs, and as we've seen that in many places, there was a slow diminution of the numbers, very quiet. Some of it was abandonment, such as we saw in places like Pōmari. Simply the houses were left empty under the guise that they were an earthquake risk, or alternatively that they're socially unmanageable and they needed redevelopment. And for example, I drive down the street on my way to work every day, and it's basically vacant lots that have had state housing demolished, and some of those have been vacant for 4 or 5 years. And we're told now that that Housing New Zealand is getting its act together, but it's still demolishing houses faster than it's building it. The reality is that some of that was part of that guise as well. Either way, there's more money going into income-related rent subsidies, particularly for Housing New Zealand, but fewer houses being provided. And one of the interesting things was that over the last year, the so-called demand, if we're going to measure it from the waiting list, jumped by 38%. All of a sudden, it jumped from around 3,800 in about this time last year to 5,500 about now. And this was rather puzzling. We were puzzled by this. What on earth changed in this period of time that meant that demand for social housing went up so miraculously? Was there a natural disaster? Was there a collapse in the economy that brought about joblessness and homelessness? Or was there something else? And one of the things that I believe has always been the case is that the waiting list has been a politically managed number. It wasn't a real number. It was a number that was managed in subtle ways by gatekeeping by MSD to ensure that it didn't embarrass the government. And recently I did an OIA on MSD, asking them to tell me over the last 4 years, or since, when did MSD minister, 2014 wasn't it? Yeah, 2014. The numbers of inquiries I've had for housing, the numbers of interviews I've done, and the number of allocations. And I said, well, these are the number of interviews and these are the number of allocations. I said, well, what about the inquiries? Oh, we don't record those. Which is amazing for an agency that says it's so driven by evidence that it doesn't actually record the numbers of people who ring up for housing assistance. An agency that I would suggest through its call centre monitors what its staff's doing quite closely, but doesn't measure the numbers of people coming in and asking for housing assistance. And so I took the issue to the I took the issue to the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman supported MSD, so that's the end of the road for that way, but I'm possibly going to revisit it in another way. The reality is that the MSD went out of its way, I think, to put barriers in the way of people applying, and I guess all of us would cite anecdotes of that, and then used that obscurity as a way of avoiding the fact that a lot of people are applying for assistance or thinking about needing assistance and not applying for it. But why did the numbers jump so quickly? And what I've got is this theory. In May 2016, Mike Wesley-Smith on TV3 did a report on Auckland's hidden homelessness, and it was based on people living in cars, and you may have seen it. I was in it. And the reality was that what I thought was so fascinating about this was that Mike got beside these people living in cars in South Auckland, in parks, and actually got them to tell a story. And one of the stories was about this middle-aged Māori guy living in a car, and he said to the people, the kids living in the car down the road, down the car park, deserve a house before me. We should be making certain that kids get housed first. And I thought that most Kiwis, all of a sudden, the homelessness had a face, and it had a reasonable face. All of a sudden, the homelessness that had kids living in cars and other working people, the working pool living in cars, started to ring a bell in terms of New Zealanders' concern about homelessness. And then in August, from June to August 2016, I was involved in a campaign called Park Up for Homes. And Annalise, who was one of my colleagues, came to me in my office and said, Alan, we've got this plan, me and Jason and a few of the people from my church, that we want to just hold a silent protest by sleeping in a car in a car park. What do you think? And I said, I think that's wonderful. I want to be part of it. So 8 of us committed $100 each to it. It was a big campaign. And Jason, who used to work with us, he said, oh, look, it's going to be terrible. There's only going to be about 30 cars and 50 people turn up. We'd planned it for the Mangere Town Centre car park. In any case, 600 cars and 1,000 people turned up. We had the TV cameras there live in the morning. There were kids, as you can see here. The shopping centre let us use their stage and sound system to give speeches. We had mums and dads bringing their kids out in their onesies and their jammies to sleep in the van overnight in June. The shopkeepers came out in the morning and gave people food for breakfast. It was such a wonderful thing, one of the most joyous protests I've ever been involved in. And that captured, I think, people's imagination. All of a sudden, and it was deliberate, we went out to try and capture middle New Zealand's interest in homelessness. And then subsequently, Lisa Owen did an expose on predatory landlords renting out garages in South Auckland, so-called sanctuary homes. And to a degree, both Lisa and I were onto this at the same time. I had told Mike Wesley-Smith about what was happening. A social worker working for a social service agency in South Auckland, who was a friend of mine, had blown the whistle on it and said, this is what's happening. She went out of her way to actually find out the addresses for these properties, and Lisa and I and Mike Wesley-Smith visited some of these addresses. And there's a slide that I could show, and it was interesting. This couple, these two women, came to our Salvation Army office and visited one of the social workers that had just been evicted. And one of them knew me vaguely and said, can Alan come and see our house? I was honoured by this. So I went with Esteban, who was a social worker, and we went to their house, and it was a garage. It was a small double garage divided into 4 rooms, 3 bedrooms and a living room. The living room really had a shelf with a fridge, a microwave, a fry pan and a TV. And there were louver windows in this living room, and some of them were broken, and this was in August. And the two women had 2 other adults living there that were whānau, and a child who they claimed had rheumatic fever, and they were paying $650 a week for that. And they had to go into the front house to go to the toilet or to wash. But the worst bit of it was the $650 a week was paid for by MSD straight to this landlord. And I think that's reprehensible. And this was exposed. And all of a sudden, I believe what happened is public sentiment about homelessness changed quite radically, and that's the reason the housing waiting list jumped up 38%. But either way, it's an important thing to believe that a managed number like this social housing waiting list is just that, and it's subject to a whole lot of contrivance by the people administering it. This is a common way of thinking about the housing needs continuum. I'm not certain where this one's come from, but, well, I am certain it's come, I think the social housing unit did one, I think MSD have done one, and I'm certain Tamaki Regeneration Company have done one similar. This idea that that there's a level of homelessness that can somehow transform magically through policy into an independence in the market. Certainly that's the rhetoric that the Tamaki Redevelopment Agency is pushing. That somehow we'll take a homeless person and one day they'll own their house. And I just think that's absolute bullshit. Because if you buy this narrative, then you can frame social housing demand as a temporary thing. That these people only need this housing for the duration of their need, implying that somehow that need's going to disappear. And if that need disappears, then you don't actually have to plan long term for the need because it's going to disappear. Sometime magically in the future we won't need social housing units because the need will have disappeared, because we will have transitioned people or pathway people into independence. And as we know, that's not the reality for many, or perhaps most of the people we work with. And I'll just use this as an example. There's this idea of housing careers. And you think about a housing career, and you think probably about your own housing career. How you started off, you left home, maybe you left voluntarily, or maybe your parents asked you to leave, I don't know. And you went flatting with your mates in the roughest house in the neighbourhood, and eventually you got your act together, and you found a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and then you stayed in rental accommodation. Then you, in my case, got the assistance from the state to buy your first house, and then you bought another house, and then all of a sudden you're worth $1 million. And that's the story of a successful baby boomer such as me, and at least financially successful. And the reality is that's a story of two things. It's a story of starting in small beginnings but having the assistance of the state, and also being able to get on the employment career ladder and having sufficient resource to manage to pay off debt and to acquire wealth. That's not the story, certainly for many people, and I guess many of us will think about someone who was on that trajectory, such as this person here, and then suffered something in middle age, whether it was an illness or an accident or a relationship breakdown or a loss of a job that meant that they were not able to regain their status in the labour market, and all of a sudden they are tenants with very few prospects of ever owning a house again. And in the report I cite examples from Australia that says that there's an emerging level of street homelessness amongst old people in their older middle age that until that point have largely led normal housing careers where they've been able to sustain their housing in the market, and all of a sudden something like that happens, illness, accident, unemployment or relationship breaks down, which means that they're homeless. And what I'm suggesting here is that will be a prospect for many of the people that we're likely to come across in our work. And in addition to that, of course, there is the prospect, particularly with the precariat, with the people who are only casually or marginally employed, that their prospects of ever owning a house are minimal, that they struggle to maintain a house and to maintain a job through most of their working life, and end up in old age without very much capacity to control their own destiny. So I think one of the things we need to challenge is this idea of a middle class baby boomer housing career. Because if we buy into that, then the need for social housing is much less. And one of the things I think we need to think about is what is it that drives demand for social housing, or demand for housing assistance? Okay, because part of that is some forms of housing need could be met in the market. Some forms of housing need will never be met in the market and have to be provided either by a social agency with a social mission or by a public agency. And for example, discrimination. I think discrimination in the rental housing market is rife and has been forever. How on earth do you overcome that? Oh, we have discrimination laws which are absolutely impossible to enforce, and if they are enforced, the penalties are so minimal that they're a joke. Perhaps the only way we're going to make certain that certain groups of people get access to housing is to go out and provide the housing to them. As a society, we say, we are going to make sure that you're housed, because we know you're not going to get a fair deal in the market. In the same way, there may simply not be the housing there that's available, and particularly for people with disabilities. There may not be a market for housing of that sort. It's so specific in terms of how it's designed and provided that no one's going to do that as a commercial enterprise. The only one that will do it is somebody with a subsidy or a public agency. And then there are things to do with the people's individual circumstances, whether or not they've got a disability or a health problem, whether or not they can secure income adequately and securely, or whether or not, and we've had here lifestyle challenges and choices. This is a euphemism for people making really bad decisions, or having bad decisions as part of their life. But we can see that maybe in this instance we can work on people's individual circumstances, but maybe in those circumstances we actually have to go out and provide the house. And what I'm suggesting here is that let's not assume that everybody needs a house, needs a social or state house, because firstly that's not feasible, and secondly it's probably not necessary. That there are other ways of correcting the problem other than providing a house. So I haven't just jumped in and said yes, we need to build a state house for everyone who needs one. I'm suggesting there are other options. But then there's some work done by a guy called Sarah Monk, who looked at, in the UK, in England and Wales, looked at who the existing social housing tenants were. And she suggested that there were three sorts of people making up the social housing market. Around 10% of the people with older housing were older people who had few housing options. They've reached the end of their working life, they were tenants, they had nowhere to go except to stay in social housing. And what I'm suggesting here is that that's going to be a growing group of people. The second are working age people who are facing some disadvantage in labour markets. Some of those people will do well and will transition out of social housing units because they manage to get things happen in their lives that allow them more independence economically, and they move out. Some of them won't. And what Sarah Monk has suggested is that we can't actually tell who those people are. We can't actually, there's no sign on their forehead that says you're a winner and you're a loser, because effectively that some of the reasons people's lives change are quite random. You know, something happens in their life and all of a sudden things are better for them and they can make more choices. But what she suggested, and this should be the thing I think that drives our whole social housing policy, is housing is an enabling thing. It's there, it's designed, it's provided as a way of making people able to make that transition if they have the capacity to do that. If they haven't, well, let's stay there. And I think part of the problem, it really hasn't come about through practice, although the rhetoric was thus, that is that we're going to review the number of people who are living in state houses, and if they don't need it, we're going to move them on. Well, we know that only happened in a small number of cases, and we also know that the numbers at which it was happening most recently had dwindled to a trickle. The reality is most people, even if they were paying close to market rents, could not afford to move out of state housing. And I think the people administering the policy knew that. But the reality was that we might still be able to enable people to do that, particularly perhaps through mixed tenure models or supported home ownership models to do that, if that's the economic way of doing things. So what I'm suggesting here, and this is a model I've worked from in our analysis, is that there's these three groups of people. Now, let's just look at this group of people. Let's just think about everyone, because most of the people who get into a state house now, as we know, are on a benefit. Almost nobody who's not on a benefit gets into state house. So who's on a benefit? These are the numbers of people on working age benefits by the type of benefit they are. And there's four categories of people here. The top blue line are job seekers who, this is like wrong. The top line are job seekers who have a health or a condition. This blue line here are the job seekers who are work ready. This line here is the numbers of sole parent people receiving sole parent support payment, and the teal line is the supported living payment. The government's made a big thing of reducing welfare numbers, and has taken something like 50,000 people off benefits over the last two years or so. But what you see in that data is it only took people off certain sorts of benefits. It only took people off benefits that were really that were either supported living sole parent payments or the work ready payments for the job seeker. The people who have got health conditions largely stayed the same. And what I'm suggesting to you is that there's around about 150,000 working age adults who will be permanently more or less on benefits. So, I mean, the numbers will change, the individuals will go move in and out, but we probably already know some people who manage to get a job for a little while, then something happens to their health or to their job and they lose it again. So they're just on the margin of the job market. But there's around about 150,000 of them, of around about 3 million working age people. About 5% of the working age population are in this group of permanently on the margins or beyond the margins of the labour market. Those are the people we're going to have to look after through housing and other ways for the rest of their life, and it's unrealistic to believe that number is going to diminish much unless the job market becomes so lovely that it embraces everyone, which is highly unlikely. So the first thing is that there's this core group of people who will, as Christ said, will always be with us in terms of being poor. But then there's another group of people who are the older tenants, people aged over 65 who are renting in the private sector. And this is where I think demand for social housing is going to come from. These are people who are at the moment over 65 and renting in the private sector. And that number, as you can see, these are the people receiving the accommodation supplement, so they're the smaller part of that group. So these are the people who are renting and also receiving some assistance. And that number, as you can see, since 2010 through to 2016, has more or less risen at a constant rate. And the forecast we're making is, why will that stop? At the very least, we think it'll continue at that rate. It may accelerate, depending on what happens to housing markets and particularly rent relative to New Zealand super. The reality is these are the poorest older people because, as we know, the accommodation supplement is nowhere near as generous as income-related rent subsidies. So these are the people most at risk. And feasibly, that number will double over the next 15 years or so. And will double at a rate of around about 1,500 to 2,000 a year. Anyway, let's look at, this is the model that I've used, is we looked at the size of the at-risk population, so it includes those people who are likely to be permanently living on working age benefits, plus older tenants. We suggested those are the at-risk population. We look at the level of need that's not being met, and particularly by measuring the numbers of people who are on the accommodation supplement as being the second best option for them. We look at what we need to meet that need, and then we make one of three decisions. Do we actually go ahead and provide additional housing? Do we continue to pay demand subsidies such as the accommodation supplement, or do we just ignore the need? Okay, those are three options, right? Fairly clear, fairly straightforward. And what I did too, and this won't be music to many people's ears, and it may have changed since the analysis was completed, but looked at the regional breakdown of this. And in particular said, look, it's likely that some regions are going to need more housing than others. Last year I was in Invercargill. Ellen was there as well, weren't you, Ellen? At the conference. And I had the whole day, so I walked from the airport to the hotel and I got lost. And my battery on my phone went and I was sort of hopelessly lost in Invercargill, which is a bit hard because it's flat and there's no landmarks. But I walked into the state housing area, and unfortunately I couldn't take a photo, but they had full lease signs on state houses. And I thought, wow, look at this, full lease signs on state houses. They can't let state houses in Invercargill. Well, why on earth would you suggest we go and build more in Invercargill, you know? And I don't mean that as a sort of derogatory way, but the reality is demand is higher in some areas than others, and we have to recognise that. But also, the ability for the market to meet demand or unmet social or demand for housing is different in different places. If there's fast population growth, then you would expect the housing stock to be struggling to keep up. Whereas if the population's quite stable, even if rents are fairly high, you could imagine a set of outcomes or a set of arrangements that would allow people who need housing to be facilitated into that private housing without a lot of problems. And so part of what you've got is there scope for market-based outcomes Is it good, modest or poor? And is the at-risk population high or relatively low? And what I'm suggesting here is that some of these things, where for example there's a high at-risk population and a very poor prospect of the market working to provide that housing, clearly you need social housing. But in the reverse situation where there is a low at-risk population and good prospects for market-related responses, probably we should focus on the market-related responses. And so it's just a suggestion, and of course, you know, some would say, well, really that's the only part we should do social housing, the rest should be market. Others would suggest that maybe the light blue or the teal blue responses should be moving more to the right on that matrix. Anyway. This is, I modelled several scenarios, particularly around what's going to happen to home ownership rates for baby boomers, because it's that baby boomer population who will obviously, particularly a tenant baby boomer population, who will form the biggest demand, in my view, for social housing over the next 15 years. And what I've assumed here is that, likely as not, the growth in that demand will be between 1,500 and 3,500 per year, and that's simply a number to stop things getting worse. That's not to meet the unmet demand that we've already got, it's simply to stop things getting worse. And that realistically it's probably between 2,000 and 2,500 units are required. And one of the things, and I'll just go to the conclusions now, we've reached a figure of 2,000 additional units per year, and we don't think that's extreme or unrealistic. And we think that's the minimum figure, and we've stated this to ensure that homelessness doesn't get worse. It's not going to solve the housing crisis. This is what you need to stop things getting worse. The Labor Party, I know, has promised 1,000, so we've straight away got a massive gap. That's the first problem I think we face. Certainly the previous government wasn't interested in that, but this for us is a line in the sand saying this is what we believe is a bare minimum, right? And I think, I'm not certain I see the workshop after this. I think this is one of the things we need to contemplate as a movement as to whether or not that's the sort of standard we want. Depending on whether we use Crown land or we buy the land, and I think in Auckland the Crown land option is a little limited, but I think it's because I think in Auckland in particular, and probably in Tauranga and even Hamilton, there'll be a need, I think, to use greenfield sites, which means buying the land in some way or other. But I think that would cost between 800 million and $1 billion a year. And there'll be all sorts of clever ways of financing that. But what I'm suggesting here is that, and the modelling I've done would suggest that if we are to engage in social housing on behalf of the state, then I don't believe it's viable without an 80% capital subsidy. So if the government and the clever people in Treasury who haven't managed to come up with an answer so far believe somehow that they can do things with debt, then they need to think again, because the reality is that much of it has to be a direct capital subsidy, whether it's Housing New Zealand doing it, whether it's a local council doing it, whether it's a community housing organisation. Either way, there has to be a massive upfront subsidy, and I'm suggesting at least 80%. The third thing is that I would suggest probably half those dwellings need to be in Auckland, and that in particular there's an undersupply of housing in Northland, Waikato Bay of Plenty and Marlborough. Other areas I would suggest in Canterbury maybe that the top end of the demand has gone away. Wellington I think starting to change a bit. It seems as though things are starting to warm up in Wellington where there's been a fairly stable market for a long time. But either way I'd suggest, and this is where we get into scraps about who's got the biggest case for more housing, but unless we can encourage people to leave Auckland, and I think we are anyway, certainly there's going to be demand there, but I think that demand is shifting to the northern part of the North Island, and Julie would know that about Hamilton, and Chris would know that about Tauranga, certainly into places like Rotorua and Whangarei. There's housing demand shifting up there, particularly with those retiring baby boomers. And we're doing some work on that, just looking at take-up on NZS, New Zealand Superannuation, and thinking about where people are actually being paid the superannuation as opposed to where you'd expect that on the basis of the 2013 census. And lastly, here I've assumed that the working age households with children will gradually do better in the housing market. I think there's going to be a correction in the housing market. I don't think it's going to be radical, but I think what's going to happen is that we'll see real increases in wages, particularly if there are growing labour shortages, and the clampdown on immigration is I believe, starting to push, bring about wage pressure. And ideally, and I think most of us would hope, that a working family should be able to afford a decent house. And in some respects, that should be the sort of society we need, that a working family in a well-paid job is able to afford a decent house. And I think that's going to become part of it, particularly if we're certain that we ensure that minimum wage levels rise and that there's an acknowledgement that people deserve to be paid more for the job they do. So that's the conclusions, and that's where we've got to. Happy to answer any questions.
Just on your very last point, was you had BNZ economist Tony Alexander speaking in Christchurch the other day, making a point he's made a few times that if there was going to be a response to labour market tightness resulting in higher wages and salary income, it would have happened by now. There seems to be some sort of change in our economic paradigm that means that this isn't actually happening. Yeah,
well, if you look at, I think the last government was using immigration as a way of subduing wage increases. Secondly, I think there was a huge amount of corruption in that, particularly around the education sector and students, and that there was quite extreme exploitation of people, and that was subduing, particularly in that unskilled service worker type category. And I'd suggest that now that's been tightened up, that if we have 20,000 fewer people coming in to take those jobs, there's going to be upward pressure on that. So I think my response would be to that, well, look at the policy settings previously and look at where the so-called leakage was, and I think it was around that immigration, and particularly the very corrupt area of immigration around bogus tertiary education courses and exploitation of migrant students.
I'll step here for a second. We're just going to swap machines.
Sure.
If I can,
Yep.
we need to just
Yep,
pop that
I'll
one down
explain
or
it.
something. And we'll have Alan take another question or two. We'll pop over. We're going to continue the discussion here. We'll have Chris and Jordan show some of the data that's come out of the supply survey and what the sector has been producing. And we'll want to keep this discussion lively going as we move into the workshop session.